Another few seconds. Okay, we can begin. All right, wonderful. Good to see you all again. We're here for the fourth class in this series on how to live the compassionate life, looking at this text by Master Atisha. So let's go ahead and start as usual with just a few, just a few prayers. I do need to have the screen share so I can share the prayers and so on. Great, there it is. Wonderful, thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and recite the Refuge and Bodhicitta prayer. Again, we'll do this the first time in English to remind ourselves of these words of taking refuge in the three jewels and then generating the motivation of bodhicitta. And then we'll do it twice more with the chanting of the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chunyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye dupar shok. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chenyan gipe sanam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shok. Okay, great. So let's do a short reflection to set our motivation. The last two times I did lead a little more in-depth meditation on bodhicitta, but I won't do that tonight, but just give a little bit of instruction just to cultivate this mind in our hearts for these teachings, recalling that this is a text in the Mahayana tradition, one that is intended to help us to fully awaken. So we need to have that proper motivation for engaging in these teachings. So let's go ahead and start with just a few minutes of focusing on the breath to calm the mind, to let go of whatever we might have kind of left over from our day that's still floating around in our minds. Try not to attend to that and just bring your awareness to the breath. Whenever you do see that the mind's gotten distracted by various thoughts and so on, try to let those go and keep returning to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection on setting our motivation of bodhicitta. So now to set our motivation of bodhicitta, I thought I'd introduce this topic of Buddha nature. We're going to be touching on in one of the verses tonight. Buddha nature is referring to the fact that every one of us has the potential to develop our minds into that state of Buddhahood. This is really the underpinning for bodhicitta. We understand that we ourselves have Buddha nature and thus can become a Buddha. And we can dedicate ourselves to helping all beings to attain that state because they too have Buddha nature. Essentially, all sentient beings have Buddha nature because they have a mind. And that mind has two aspects to it. One is what we call the kind of developmental component or developmental Buddha nature. It's the fact that over time, we can develop these amazing qualities of a Buddha. We can go from having minds that are under the control of our afflictions, our anger, our attachment, jealousy, pride, ignorance, and so on. We can move to a state where we have purified all those negative tendencies and have actualized all the positive qualities to the greatest degree. Qualities of compassion and loving kindness, patience, wisdom, all these amazing qualities can be brought to this infinite degree. This is the developmental aspect of our minds. It's rooted in the fact that all of these states of mind that are positive can overcome those that are negative, because the negative ones are all grounded in ignorance, in the not knowing the nature of reality. The other component of Buddha nature, though, is essentially the emptiness of the mind. The fact that the mind does not have any inherent or intrinsic existence. This is what creates the space for us to develop our minds. All these negative tendencies are not inherent to the mind. Our minds can change because they are empty. They do not have any intrinsic existence, anything that is concretely within the mind. So we have these two aspects that we need to understand as the foundation for why bodhicitta makes complete sense. Our own aspiration to develop our minds to the state of Buddhahood, so we can then help others to do the same. And this is because we all possess Buddha nature. Every single being has that potential. Every single being can therefore become a Buddha. Meeting with the proper causes and conditions, they can attain that state. So when we generate bodhicitta, we're dedicating ourselves to helping all beings to do that, to become one of the causes and conditions for others to achieve their potential, to actualize their Buddha nature. So generate that mind now, aspiring to achieve complete enlightenment, Buddhahood, so we then can lead all other beings to attaining that same state. And then you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. Just need to wet my throat a little. Okay, good. All right, so in the last class, we made it up, I think, through verse 11. And once more, recall that this text by Lama Atisha, it doesn't have like a formal structure to it in the way that we often see texts around the Lam Rim or something, the stages of the path. It's these little bits of advice, little wonderful pieces of wisdom and instruction that we can, practice in our own lives, and especially on the Bodhisattva path. And the idea is kind of like a necklace of these amazing jewels that we can wear, adorn ourselves with. And we talked earlier in one of the verses about how all the external ornaments, those are things we can do to adorn this body, but essentially what we want to do here is to adorn our minds with these amazing qualities, with these practices that will help us to be kind of in harmony with others, to be of benefit to others in terms of how we are interacting with them and so on. So we're not seeing, maybe some of the more traditional teachings that are set out in regard to a bodhisattva, but nonetheless, we're getting lots of little pieces of advice that hopefully you can begin to apply in your own life and kind of find some wisdom in these little bits of advice. So let's go ahead and start with verse 12. We'll have hopefully be able to end a little earlier tonight for any questions you might have. And certainly if you have questions from anything we've covered so far, you can bring those up then. But I'm going to talk about the first 2 lines of verse 12 first, and then go on to the last 4 lines. When you encounter the causes of happiness, in these always persevere. Of course, this does, hinge on that idea of what is happiness. You know, in Buddhism, of course, we are always talking about a happiness that is internal, that is much deeper than the traditional ways we achieve some measure of happiness or pleasure, some level of satisfaction in our lives, which tends to be through external sources, right? We enjoy all these various things throughout our day, and we think that those are true causes of happiness. But as is stated in the teachings on the nature of samsara, these things are actually not in kind of true happiness. They don't really bring about something that we can rely upon. They're transitory, they change, they don't have a lasting nature. So, what we're talking about here when it says the causes of happiness, we're referring to the happiness that is much deeper, that we can have to an even greater and greater degree. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would often talk about this as the happiness of Dharma, but of course he didn't coin that term. He got that term through many teachings that he had, seen in his researching of things. Rinpoche was quite amazing if you ever had an opportunity to have teachings from him, because he had this little booklet that he would always carry with him, and it had all these wonderful little verses from all these great Indian and Tibetan masters with little bits of instruction and advice on how to practice the Dharma and so on. So it really is, this term of happiness of Dharma, we can see in certain teachings that Rinpoche did reference. And this is a translation from Lama Zopa Rinpoche of a couple of pieces of advice from Asanga. Asanga lived in the, I think, 1st to 2nd century, somewhere in there, and is renowned for having begun what's called the mind only, or the Chittamatra system of tenets. But a great master. He said, this is the way Rinpoche translated this: the happiness of enjoying Dharma covers the entire body. It happens whenever you want. It exists in all the 3 realms. Once you achieve it, you have it wherever you are born, because that's the lasting quality of the happiness of the Dharma, is that as you progress, developing your mind more and more in the direction of enlightenment, then you have these amazing qualities that you are carrying with you from lifetime to lifetime, all the way through to Buddhahood. The last one, it causes you to achieve the 7 riches of the Aryas. You'll remember that phrase, the 7 riches or gems of the Aryas. We saw that earlier in our text, and even went through the verse that comes later in the text that refers to those 7 riches or 7 gems. So I'm not going to talk about them again, but essentially what you see is those sort of qualities, which again involve things like having the faith, ethics, generosity, giving, learning, and so on. We have all these amazing things that we can accumulate on our path. Well, these things are caused by having the happiness of Dharma, engaging in the Dharma. Continuing with that bit of advice, Rinpoche's quote of Asanga, it says, by enjoying the happiness of Dharma, it never finishes. It only increases more and more. It's not like our ordinary sources of happiness where it finishes. You eat that delicious meal and it's over. The happiness was temporary. It only, satisfied for the moment, but it didn't bring us any real lasting happiness or well-being. Enemies cannot destroy it, Asanga says. You can carry it to your next lives. You can complete the happiness of Dharma and achieve satisfaction. You can complete it by achieving the greatest level of happiness and well-being, the state of Buddhahood, and achieve what he calls it just satisfaction, but it's the ultimate satisfaction. It's the ultimate culmination of, what we have the potential to become. As I mentioned in the motivation tonight, Buddha nature, we have the ability to transform our minds into the state of a Buddha. So again, this happiness of Dharma, we have to see, as the verse said, we have to identify the causes of that and engage in those, enjoy those, because that is what will lead to our greatest sense of well-being and the fulfillment of our potential for attaining the state of Buddhahood and so on, which is said to be an amazingly blissful state. Obviously, I don't have any knowledge of what that is like, but it must be incredible to be free of all of what disturbs our minds, which is essentially one component of Buddhahood, and to develop everything that is positive, to where you're just living from a space of complete compassion, loving kindness, wisdom, and so on. So this is the goal. This is what we're trying to attain. So again, in our verse, it was simply stating that we need to kind of seek out those causes of happiness, and whenever we encounter them, well, then persevere in those, because that's what's going to lead you to true peace and happiness. The problem, of course, with all the other things that bring more temporal happiness is that they frequently become a pattern of attachment in our lives, where we keep craving and grasping at those things, thinking that they're going to give us some deeper pleasure or happiness. And they really don't. Can do this a zillion times. And of course, we have done it a zillion times in the countless lifetimes that we've had. And we've never gained anything more than a transitory moments of happiness from that. No real true happiness. So we have to begin to see this. This is some teachings that we often see in the middle scope of the Lam Rim when we look at the nature of samsara. We see that pleasures, the tendency to kind of go to these external factors for happiness, that this is not the way to achieve true happiness. They often use the phrase of it's like drinking salt water to quench your thirst. You just keep craving more and more and more. The happiness of Dharma, however, is satisfying. It does lead us to that kind of eventual peace that we can attain and the great state of well being that is Buddhahood. And as we move our minds in that direction, there is more contentment and satisfaction internally. And we're not so caught up in all these transitory pleasures because we see that there's a deeper source of happiness. So all the things that are talked about on the path of engaging in, generosity and morality and patience and joyous effort, the other perfections, all of these things, all the practices of the Dharma will lead us on that path to attaining true happiness. So I don't need to say too much more about that. That's again wonderful piece of advice from Lama Atisha, to say essentially, yes, we need to really seek out and persevere in what will bring about true happiness, rather than investing all of our time and energy into getting all these transitory pleasures that we've had a zillion times before and have never really brought us anything more than that temporary relief. The last four lines are kind of an interesting one. It says, whichever task you take up first, address this task primarily. In this way, you ensure the success of both tasks. Some of the texts don't have this translation of both tasks, but I'm assuming what that means is the one that you take up first and the one that would follow. Because we do have a tendency of maybe multitasking, and it's more than even just two tasks. It's a zillion tasks that we have, and we aren't even finishing one because we're constantly distracted by others. But he says, in this way, you ensure the success of everything you endeavor, essentially, whereas otherwise you accomplish none of them. So this is, again, might seem like kind of maybe advice that you got from your parents. Make sure that when you sit down to do your homework, that you get this homework done before you go on to the next one, and then you do that one completely, and then go on to the next one. There's some logic to that we perhaps learned earlier in our lives of how we encounter things even in our mundane world. There's some usefulness in taking something to its conclusion before we move on to something else. On the spiritual path, this is obviously very important as well. We're trying to generate kind of progressively more and more qualities, more and more realizations of the path, and so on. So we really do have to be very conscientious around how we spend our time. and think, okay, if this is what I need to do now, this is the advice I'm getting from my teachers, or this is where I'm at in my own progress and going through the Lam Rim and meditation and so on, that's what I need to stay with. That's where I need to keep working on in order to get to the next level, complete that task and then move on, complete that, move on, and so on. Again, these things might seem kind of like uh, common sense in some regard, but there's some necessity of us actually doing that. And I do think that we tend to be a little more, um, don't have such good attention when it comes to the things that we decide to engage in. There's some wonderful advice from Shantideva, the namesake of your center there in Brooklyn, in his wonderful text, The Way of the Bodhisattva, that I've been quoting from here and there. He says in verse 543, when something has been planned and started on, attention should not drift to other things. With thoughts fixed on the chosen target, that and that alone should be pursued. There's a great benefit to kind of staying on track with the one thing that we are deciding that we want to work on. Alan Wallace, who many of you have heard of, maybe you've even had some teachings from him, he wrote a wonderful book called The Attention Revolution, which is primarily about going through the stages, of developing this single pointed concentration, this state that we call calm abiding. And in the introduction to this book, he talks about how we have these labels now for ADD and ADHD, right? And he says we all have attention deficit disorder. It's just a matter of degrees. Attention is a really important factor on our path. We need to attend to what it is that we are working on, what it is that we are trying to develop. Say we were wanting to make a concerted effort to address patterns of anger that we have in our minds. Well, if we don't kind of attend to that and really keep working at that and make sure that anything we meet that would be a temptation for that mind to arise and for us to engage in, saying harsh words or doing, things that would be harmful to the person who's offending us, whatever, we want to make sure we're addressing that. We need to have an attention that is constantly, you know, on target, helping us to progress in our spiritual development in regard to dealing with whatever it is that we have on our plate at the moment. This is important. If we're instead, oh, I'm going to start off, I wake up in the morning and I think I'm going to work on this, and then half hour later I'm working on something else, and then I'm working on a third thing, and the mind's all over the place. We probably don't make much progress in any of those things because we're not going about it in this more methodical way. So there's a lot of logic again behind this, but it's really important spiritual advice. The second verse that is follows from that in Master Shantideva's text says, behaving in this way, all tasks are well performed, and nothing is achieved by doing otherwise. If thus we act, then this secondary defilement or affliction that's called non introspection or lack of introspection, sometimes called inattention, will not grow. Essentially, this introspection, I think I don't know if I've talked about introspection yet in this course, but introspection is that factor of our minds. Whoops, I got really blurry there. Sorry. Let me turn off my video. Introspection is this factor of our minds. It's kind of keeping an eye on things. We don't need it there all the time. Just like going back to when you were doing homework with your parents or giving you advice. You don't want your parents hovering over you the whole time, right, while you're doing your homework, like, back off, mom and dad. It's the same thing in regard to introspection. We don't need introspection all the time because we are able to maintain some continuity of what we are attending to, what we are focusing on. But if we don't have any introspection at all, well, then essentially we're going to lose our attention. We're going to be on something else. We are not going to be able to maintain an awareness of what we're trying to do. That whole fifth chapter of Master Shantideva is again about this. I think it's sometimes called guarding alertness or even introspection in some texts. It is about how do we cultivate that quality to our minds? How do we make sure that we are attending to what we're supposed to be doing as we go about our interactions with others and so on? So it's very important that we have that factor. And if we practice this of attending to what it is we're working on right now, kind of seeing it to its conclusion, then we are keeping that non introspection or inattention from arising because we're going to be staying on track, addressing what needs to be addressed. So again, this is some wonderful advice. Alex Berzin, in his commentary, he talks about an interesting topic that I always love sharing this with people because I think it's really relevant to us as Dharma practitioners, in terms of making decisions about what we do with our time, because there are many things we can do. And even in terms of the activities we engage in, not just our Dharma study and practice and so on. But this is what he says. He says, when choosing what to do, how to spend our time, what people to spend it with, and so on, we choose. This is actually advice you're going to see in the next screen. I think it's the next screen is from the Dalai Lama, from some advice that Alex got from him. But the way I've enumerated these, this is my enumeration. First, we choose according to our talents. I mean, there is some usefulness to that, right? If there are certain things that we can offer because we are well versed in that, well, that makes some sense for us to do that because it's already something we know. Certainly, we can acquire new skills and new abilities, but that always takes time. Yeah. And of course, the older we get, the less time we feel like we have. So perhaps it makes some sense to do the things that we're already qualified to do, that we have some talents around. So that one, again, we can see how that makes sense in terms of decisions that we're about what we do with our time. Secondly, this is an interesting one. According to what most needs to be done and what is not being done by many other people. If we're replicating what other people are doing, it's a bit redundant then, right? We don't need to be doing what other people are quite efficiently and effectively doing. And if there are things that need to be done that we feel that, again, our skills might be a good match for, well, that's a really wonderful thing to be able to offer because there are people who need our services in regard to what it is we are doing. It doesn't mean that everything we do has to have that, this is something not being done by someone else or what have you. But it is one factor that I think is useful. Oops, I didn't mean to hit that. I meant to hit the down button on there. Okay, so let's go down to the next one, the third factor that His Holiness says. Third, according to what would benefit the largest number of people. Now, this makes some sense too. Alex says this is the advice His Holiness gave me. And again, the benefits we're thinking of in terms of that third one are not just those that would be realized in this lifetime. Of course, this means that if we're doing all of our actions with that biggest motivation of bodhicitta, well, then we are fulfilling that third one. We're benefiting all beings with everything that we do. But nonetheless, I think it is worthwhile to take a look at, well, what we are doing, is it having an effect on a greater number of beings? Yes, our bodhicitta motivation will assure that everything we do has amazing ramifications beyond just those beings that we're working with at the moment. But the idea is that if we are actually able to benefit more beings in this world in terms of our actions, what we are committing ourselves to doing, well, that's a pretty amazing benefit, right? Again, I don't think that this means that if we only have one being in front of us and that one being needs something that we can offer and we feel like we are the one to do it, that we should say, oh, it's only one being. Well, then I shouldn't do it because it's not benefiting many beings. That one being is there due to your karma with that one being, and you should fulfill whatever it is that you can for that being, helping them by giving them your time or, helping them with whatever task they have at hand and so on. So don't think that this third factor means, oh, well, then if I'm not able to benefit many beings, then I shouldn't do it. You can, of course, as I was just saying earlier, benefit many beings by having the motivation of bodhicitta. So if that one person comes up to you and they need some time from you to do something, you generate your bodhicitta motivation and you think, I'm doing this in the moment for this one being, but with the motivation of benefiting all beings. Then all of your actions become very powerful. The Lama Zopa Rinpoche was very keen on bodhicitta motivation. In fact, he has a whole little booklet of advice about cultivating bodhicitta mindfulness in everyday activities. Where when we're doing the dishes, we think about washing away the afflictions of all beings. Or if flush the toilet, you think about all the defilements of beings being removed from them and so on. I mean, you can transform all of your activities into amazing virtuous activities with bodhicitta. So His Holiness's advice pertains to those three things. What are you skilled in? Where are your talents? What isn't being done or needs to be done that you could be contributing to the welfare of others? And thirdly, what might benefit the most beings? It's interesting. There's a fourth factor that's added, and I want to share this one because I think this one really helps us in some regard as well. Because as you'll see, it gives us another space for how we might choose. Alex says that there's this, I think I don't know if he's a Nyingma master or a Rime, a kind of a non-sectarian Tibetan Buddhist teacher, but Ringu Toka is his name. Ringu Toka reaffirmed when he was visiting here in Berlin little while ago. I don't remember when these teachings were given by Alex, but probably quite some time. Ringo Toku said, when we're choosing how to spend our time and whom to help, another factor to consider is what we personally would get out of it. It's kind of interesting. We have so many teachings about avoiding self-cherishing and self-centeredness, but Ringo Toku says, we actually do need to consider what we personally would get out of whatever it is that we undertake. That's because until we're very high bodhisattvas, there's always going to be some selfish component to our motivations. So, for instance, there are certain things we might do that would give us a lot of energy. I think this is perfectly fine advice, right? Because we can't always be thinking this high and mighty bodhisattva, I'm already this highly advanced being and I can do all these things without any regard to how I'm going to feel about doing them. Again, over time, we can hopefully divest ourselves of some of that self-interest. But initially, especially, we really want to be quite excited about what we're doing. We want to feel like, oh, this is really enriching for me, and I'm being of benefit to others. And I found in my life, even before finding Buddhism, that a lot of the things I chose to do were in that nature. And oftentimes it was about, helping others, providing some sort of services to others, and so on. But my heart was in it. I really wanted to do those things as well. I really found them very enriching for myself. And I think, again, that's a perfectly fine criterion. It shouldn't be the only criterion for how we decide what to do with our lives, right? Otherwise, we just end up engaging in all kinds of hedonistic stuff that's only feeding this grasping mind that's just craving all these wonderful experiences. But if we really think about having looked at those first three criteria and saying, okay, these are the things that I want to try to focus on with my time, with my energy, because it does make some sense to be trying to benefit others through the skills I have and so on. Well, which of those things gives me a lot of energy, gives me this spark of being involved in those activities that I can get something for myself? And there's nothing wrong with that, something for yourself, because with bodhicitta motivation, again, you keep recycling that, you keep refeeding that into wanting to do more, wanting to help others to an even greater degree. So don't think that it's selfish. I'm going to talk about a little bit more of this or share a little bit more of this in terms of what Alex says. He says there are also certain people whom we might help or spend our time with who have a lot of positive energy and who would give us inspiration, whereas others would just drain our energy and make us feel very exhausted after having been with them. So these also can be factors in choosing how to spend our time and whom to help. you know, this is interesting advice, right? It's not just saying that we, should just once more be okay with any particular situation. Over time, as we develop our minds, yes, that may be perfectly possible. We'll go to those really tough places with people who we don't enjoy being with and working with, and we have a fortitude and a enthusiasm for doing that. But initially, we really do need to attend to that aspect of it as well. Where do you get that juice from in terms of the people that you're with? So if you're finding a particular spiritual community or particular group to be really enriching for you, you're going to get a lot out of it because you'll be hanging around with these people who really give you a good charge in terms of what is going on. Well, that's a big factor too, because the more we feel enthusiastic about what we're doing, especially when we're engaging in virtue, the better it is for everybody involved. So don't think that once more we have to kind of make ourselves a martyr on the bodhisattva path and only do things that we don't enjoy doing or with the people that we don't like being around. That's not really the ideal way to go about it. We want to find what gives us joy. And then as we develop that inner joy through repeated practice and so on, then we might be able to sustain that joy even in the most difficult circumstances where we're doing things that we don't necessarily want to do or feel inclined to do or what have you. There's one more little piece of advice that Alex gives, and this is in terms of our own practice, which I think is kind of uh, hits the nail on the head. when it comes to choosing what to work on ourselves, what is it we need to work on within ourselves, the advice is always to meditate on bodhicitta. That is the best thing and the biggest source of energy. Because it is really true. Bodhicitta is meant to be this unbelievable kind of dynamic force that can help us to move in whatever direction we want to. If we have bodhicitta motivation, then we know we're not just doing this spiritual path for ourselves, we're doing it for all beings. So there's already within that this force, this energy that can be really quite enriching. But again, takes time to cultivate it and get it to that point. And obviously, when it says bodhicitta, it means everything that supports bodhicitta. So in the traditional teachings on the Lam Rim, you have the three levels. Bodhicitta isn't taught till the third level. So you have to engage in the first and the second levels to get to the third level. So anything that helps you to cultivate bodhicitta, to generate this awakening mind, to utilize it in your life and in your practice, well, that's well worthwhile. That's really the core of our spiritual practice. His Holiness the Dalai Lama will often refer to this as the good heart. There's a lot of things we could call the good heart, loving kindness, compassion, and so on. Bodhicitta is the good heart in the most complete way. It's imbued with compassion and loving kindness for all beings, and moreover has that commitment to being a benefit to them through wanting to become a Buddha for their sake. So the idea is that there's something really very powerful and dynamic about that mind. So any energy we put into that in terms of our own spiritual practice and anything that supports us getting to bodhicitta is well worth the effort. Let's go on then. Only covered one verse so far. That was kind of one that I knew I would talk about a little bit more. Verse 13, this is an interesting translation. I'm going to share an alternate translation in a moment. Since you take no pleasure in negative deeds, when a thought of self-importance arises, at that instant, deflate your pride and recall your teacher's instructions. So, in this way that it's translated, I have a hard time tying the first line to the rest of it. But obviously, on the Bodhisattva path, we are not to take any pleasure in negative deeds. We're really supposed to put our attention into what is virtuous and positive and refrain from engaging in what is negative. But I think the implication in the way that it's translated here is that if you do engage in lots of virtue, then because you're not taking pleasure in negative deeds, well, you can develop some self-importance, some pride, right? Oh, aren't I wonderful? I'm such a good bodhisattva. I'm doing such amazing things and helping so many beings with all these acts of generosity and so on. So when those thoughts of self-importance, which is kind of one side of the equation, we're going to see discouragement in the next verse. Pride is when we feel really good about ourselves in this distorted way. When that arises, we'll deflate it instantly. See that pride is a problem. Pride is a distraction. And it says there, recall your teacher's instructions. And we're going to see what that is in terms of the slides in a moment, but it's essentially recall that everything is impermanent and changing, and death will come, and everything that we have done in a sense that we might feel prideful about is just a fleeting passing experience. And we need not cling to it with that mind of pride, but rather recognize the transitory nature of those things. But I do want to talk just a little bit about pride. Pride, of course, is highlighted as one of the 6 root afflictions in the traditional teachings on minds and mental factors, these various components of our mind. There are 6 root afflictions and there are 20 secondary afflictions. Non-introspection, that I mentioned just a short while ago, is one of the secondary ones. Pride is one of the root ones. Well, why? Because pride is such an obstacle to our spiritual development. When we start thinking of ourselves through that lens of, ain't I great? Don't I have a lot going on for me? Where we're kind of comparing ourselves to others and thinking we're so much better than others. That's like the poison for our spiritual practice. Because spiritual practice, of course, in Buddhism is about deflating our ego, which pride is all revolving around, right? Elevating ourselves to the superior position, thinking so much of ourselves. Yeah. In the traditional teachings, there are 7 types of pride, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but I want to talk about the first 3 because they demonstrate how pride can become really quite distorted. I don't know that I can't always remember the exact names of these, but the very first one is what we normally think of as pride, which is I think I'm better than those that I'm perceiving as inferior, right? And maybe in terms of certain qualities, we might be superior to others, right? I've got, more knowledge of this than somebody does have, or I've got more money in the bank than the other person has, or I have whatever. You can think about lots of things in our world that you can have pride around. That is kind of what we normally call pride. But then there's what's called this kind of equal pride, where there's somebody who has the same qualities and things that we have, but we think we're better than them, right? So that's kind of more distorted, right? Because I'm actually equal to this person, but I think I'm better than the worst one, where I actually think that I'm better than the person who's superior to me. You know, if I were to say, oh, the Dalai Lama has got nothing on me, right? I got more qualities than the Dalai Lama. I mean, you see how absurd that sounds, right? If I were to have that thought, to think with this prideful mind, I'm better than someone who's actually quite superior to me. That's a really distorted version of pride. Anyway, if you do get a chance to study the different levels of pride, it's quite insightful because we see even there's this pride of humility where I think I'm the worst of everyone. And that's like still attached to the sense of who I am being the best in my humility or something, which is really weird. But anyway, pride has many different flavors and shades to it. So we need to make sure that we identify that mind when it's arising, particularly around our spiritual practice. Yeah. They always say that the antidote to pride is to think about all the things you don't know. The fact that you are still here in samsara, dealing with this unconditioned or this conditioned existence and not free from that yet. So what are we? What is there to be so prideful about? We haven't achieved any, huge, marvelous thing through the time that we've spent on the spiritual path. Yeah, you may have some greater insight of this or that, and take note of that and be okay with that, but don't become prideful about those things. Again, try to reduce that as much as we can. So let me share a few of the slides that I put together on this that will give a little more elaboration. This is the alternate translation, by the way. It says there, this is Brian Beresford did the translation in that book, Advice from a Spiritual Friend, that I've been quoting here and there. He says it this way: always be apart from liking evil. And in our text, it said, since you take no pleasure in negative deeds, and it had a kind of continuation into the next sentence, always be apart from liking evil. He's kind of identifying it as that's a separate instruction. Always be apart from engaging in and enjoying negative deeds. That's fine advice across the board for any Buddhist practitioner. But then this rest of it is pretty similar. Whenever a pompous mind arises, flatten such arrogance. Get rid of your pride. Recall the teachings of your master. So, what are the teachings of your master? Let's see what Geshe Nyawen Darge says about that. He says, pride or conceit is one of the worst emotional afflictions. If we feel that by having developed the awakening mind, bodhicitta, we are superior to others, then everyone will disparage us. If we are supercilious and pompous, no one will find us compatible. As an opponent to arrogance, we should meditate on impermanence and death. That's recalling the instructions of our master, that anything we have in this life, it's transitory. It's not going to be there forever. We will end up leaving this life. Hopefully, we'll take some of the qualities that we have cultivated with us, but we shouldn't get so prideful about these, kind of experiences that we're having now, because death will come. And all these things will change. In such a time, this is from Alex Berzin, when we have a feeling of superiority about anything, like our bodhicitta meditation, our practice, oh, I'm so holy, and oh, I'm doing so well, and so on. We need to cut off our pride and remember our teacher's guideline instructions, that we're like the tide of the ocean that goes up and down, up and down. Sometimes we feel very proud that we're doing so well. Other times we get discouraged and think we're so terrible. So this is another way of thinking about that kind of impermanence, is that we do vacillate between these two kinds of minds. And as I said, we're going to look at discouragement in the next verse. We kind of go from feeling very prideful and so elated at what we're doing and how well things are going. And then we drop down to that discouragement when we think everything's just falling apart. I can't meditate. I don't even know what bodhicitta is at the moment, whatever. Kind of lose the plot. In conclusion, from another commentary by Lama Gyurme that I've quoted here and there, it is important to remember that our achievements are fleeting and inconsequential in the face of death. We are not alone in our accomplishments. Others have surpassed us in various ways. This knowledge should humble us and prevent the growth of ego. So even just at the times when pride is arising, think about His Holiness the Dalai Lama or Lama Zopa Rinpoche, any of these other wonderful masters, and what their qualities are like, because we've seen that embodied in them, the way that they are with others, the way that they show such amazing humility and so on. By hiding our best qualities, he says, and not seeking validation or recognition, we can maintain inner balance. We even saw that advice about hiding our qualities in verse 3 earlier on in the text. We should heed the advice of our masters and contemplate the impermanence of life. Remember, the true light within us should remain concealed like a burning flame inside a pot. We saw that same analogy in one of the earlier verses. That was, I think, with verse 3. We don't really want to be just bragging about what we've done and our qualities and who we are and all this stuff. You have your qualities, develop your qualities. That's a part of the path, but keep them kind of hidden inside you, like a flame of a lamp that's inside a clay vessel or a pot or what have you. So again, this is some good advice in terms of how we deal with that prideful mind that is one extreme we fall to. The next verse, as I said, goes into the discouraged mind, the mind that, you know, really thinks the worst of ourselves, which can become a source of that kind of laziness we talked about earlier, that is self-defeatism, that really isn't acknowledging that each of us can develop qualities. We just need to be persevering and putting energy into our spiritual practice. So, verse 14 says, when discouraged thoughts arise, uplift your mind. I'm going to stop there with just the first two lines. When discouraged thoughts arise, uplift your mind. So what does this mean? It means that, at those times when we feel like, okay, things ain't going so great. I don't feel like my meditation's all that, and I really am frustrated in my spiritual practice. Well, remember once more that your mind has the potential to achieve enlightenment, that Buddha nature that I mentioned in the motivation tonight. And we have to rely upon that over time we can achieve that. As I mentioned in the motivation, we have kind of two aspects to our bodhicitta. The one that we tend to think of, I'm sorry, to our Buddha nature. The one that we tend to think of in regard to Buddha nature is the developmental side of it. That idea that we can take our minds and develop them over time, eventually achieving this state of enlightenment. It's not maybe a straight trajectory from, all the way down here, all the way up there. We bounce around quite a bit. But the idea is that with perseverance and diligence, we can make it to that state. We have developmental nature. And the kind of more deeper nature, our sort of naturally abiding nature, is the emptiness of the mind. That is the Buddha nature component that allows for us to develop our minds, that our minds are not inherently existent, that the anger in our minds and the frustration in our minds and the jealousy and the pride and all these other delusions, that these things are not in the true nature of our minds. They can be removed. They use this phrase that they are adventitiously there. Adventitiousness means that they are essentially there because the force hasn't been created to remove them. They're only there because of that. And if we create the force that removes them, they will go away. I use this analogy a lot. Some of you have heard me use it before, but I like to think of Buddha nature in terms of a glass of water that essentially is fundamentally clear, right? If I had this wonderful glass of water here, you'd see right through it, see my hand on the other side of it, and so on. But if I went out to my yard and I got some dirt and I started shoving the dirt into the water and mixing it all up, right? Then I'd hold the glass in front of you and it would be completely opaque. You wouldn't be able to see the clarity of that water. Well, our minds are like that water that it's fundamentally clear. The only reason why we have the mind stained right now by our afflictions, by our ignorance, by all these other crazy delusions, is because we haven't done the purification to remove them. Going back to that glass of water with all the dirt in it, if I do run it through very fine filters and purify it completely, then I've got my clear water returning, right? Well, we've never had a mind that's been free of all those things, unlike the glass of water. We've always had a mind that's been together with this. So we might think that's really the nature of my mind. The nature of my mind is to have ignorance, is to have anger, is to have all these crazy delusions. No, these are just like the dirt and the water. They can be removed. So we have these two kind of working in tandem. The mind is empty or lacking any inherent existence. These delusions are lacking any inherent existence. They can be changed. They can be removed because they have that emptiness. And on the basis of that, we can develop the mind. We can remove those negative tendencies and replace them with the positive tendencies that can be developed to an infinite degree. Remember that wonderful word sangye that we recited in the refuge verse at the beginning of tonight. Sangye, these two syllables, this is what the Tibetan scholars who came up with the Tibetan language on the basis of the Sanskrit teachings that were brought in from India, the teachings of the Buddha. That word Buddha, which means awakened one, they took and translated it as two words, Sang and Ge. Sang, S-A-N-G, that's how it's phoneticized. That means essentially to completely purify, to completely remove all that sediment, that garbage that's in our minds. Gye, G-Y-E, has the connotation of completely developing all the positive qualities. So, what is a Buddha, a fully awakened being? Someone who has done that work, who has completely removed what is negative, completely developed what is positive. Buddha nature is the underlying foundation for why that is possible. So, what was going on in that verse that we were just working with? It says essentially, again, when discouraged thoughts arise, when you get kind of frustrated at the fact that it seems like it's taking forever for my mind to change, and I take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and what have you. Well, recall Buddha nature, uplift your mind by recalling that nature of our minds, that our minds are not cast in stone and therefore can develop, can change. It's really very inspiring. You know, essentially, we can say that the teachings on Buddha nature are pointing to the fact that we're all fundamentally this pure, kind of good, wholesome being underneath all the garbage. I didn't really get that message when I was growing up Roman Catholic. I got the message that I was sort of tainted from the beginning. I had original sin and all this stuff, if you are familiar with what Catholicism teaches. But this is a very enriching teaching for the Buddha to tell us that we've got this kind of jewel within us. We have this essence within us that can be developed to this degree. There's a wonderful text, the Uttara Tantra by Buddha Maitreya, that is taught that goes into Buddha nature and all the various similes that are used to refer to it. But the whole concept of it is we've got something that is kind of hidden that is very precious. Our Buddha nature can be developed into this amazing experience. You just have to trust that process and continue to keep doing it and not get discouraged. You know? So again, discouragement is going to arise at times. Certainly, we're going to have occasions where we feel kind of down in the dumps on the basis of what's going on. But we have to remember our Buddha nature. All right, this is from Geshe Awandargi on this first 2 lines of verse 14. Very few people have a steady or stable experience of life. For most, their emotions ebb and flow like the tides. Sometimes we may feel proud of signs of accomplishment. That was again in verse 13, the pride there. And yet at others, we may be depressed when our defilements and habitual propensities overwhelm us. We just feel like, God, I can't do anything with this stubborn donkey of a mind. All such feelings are relative to one another because discouragement exists only in relation to elation. Neither one is independent. It is beneficial if our life flows with little major change, like a wide river. He's just giving us that general advice about this is the nature of our minds for them to go up and down, to be a bit like a yo-yo. We get really elated at one point, really kind of down and discouraged at another. Therefore, we should not become too excited when we accomplish a great deal or depressed when we fail to do so. If we feel self-pity, we should contemplate on our good fortune at having a fully endowed precious human form, which of course is the ideal basis to awaken our Buddha nature and to begin to move in that direction. These teachings on having a precious human rebirth or perfect human rebirth are at the very beginning of the Lam Rim because they are the foundation for us to understand the opportunity we possess right now to awaken our Buddha potential, to begin to move in that direction. And maybe we have touched on it in previous lives. No doubt we've had beginningless lifetimes, but it's really important that we kind of go a pretty good distance in this life with what we have in terms of the condition of this perfect human existence. There's one teaching, I can't remember who I got this from, but they say that we can consider this life to be like one segment of a relay race, right? If you've ever ran a relay race, your job is to get as much, from the point that where you get the baton to the point where you hand it off, to go as quickly as you can so that you've got a good time for the people that are taking the baton for the next part of it so you can win the race. Again, I don't want to get too much into this whole analogy of winning, but the idea is I want to make sure that while I've got the baton, I'm doing the best that I can for my next existence. When I pass the baton in a way to my next lifetime, I won't be Don any longer, but everything I do that is positive and wholesome will carry with me. And if I have diminished my negative tendencies, that will carry with me as well. So do what we can while we have this perfect human rebirth to move in the direction that our Buddha nature is pointing to, which is the fact that we all can attain that state eventually. Just takes time, just takes energy, and so on. Now, in our text, I won't put it on the screen right now, but essentially this next line, it said, when discouraged thoughts arise, uplift your mind. And the third line was, and meditate on the emptiness of both. And in the footnote that is in the mind training text that we are using, Thupten Jinpa's translation, the footnote there said meditate on the emptiness of both self-importance, pride, and discouragement, which makes some sense because those were the states of mind that we just talked about. Nonetheless, Alex Berzin in his says meditate on the voidness or the emptiness of both states, referring to the states of samsara and nirvana in that case. And then when we go to the text with Brian Beresford's translation and Geshe Ngawandargi's commentary, it seems like that is being related to the last two lines of this verse, where we talk about the emptiness of both the things that are objects of pleasure and that are objects of pain or difficulty. So I want to talk just very briefly about emptiness. Emptiness is obviously one of the most important teachings that the Buddha gave, because while there's great importance in things like bodhicitta and all these teachings on karma and so many other subjects that are really, really important, emptiness is the key that will unlock the entire process. It is what will allow you to attain freedom from samsara and accomplish the peace of nirvana. But moreover, it is also the force by which you can go beyond your own individual nirvana to attain the non-abiding nirvana of Buddhahood, that state where you will have attained complete freedom from what kept you bound in cyclic existence. But moreover, you will be able to benefit others. So you're not going to kind of just check out of samsara. You're going to stay involved with beings, but you also are not in samsara. So you're kind of, it's called non-abiding nirvana because you're not stuck in either state in some sort of solitary peace that is nirvana, nor are you stuck in samsara any longer. This is what we ideally want to attain, is to get to that place of accomplishing our true potential. Again, our Buddha nature is brought to its fullest conclusion by our accomplishment of that state, this non-abiding nirvana. So the key to attaining that, there are many factors involved in attaining it, obviously, because the path is very rich and very involved. But one of the most important factors is the wisdom of emptiness. That's because the root of all of our problems and the root of what's keeping us bound in this unenlightened existence is the ignorance that grasps at things as if they had their own inherent identity. They have some nature, some identity that we can conventionally identify, but they don't exist by way of that identity. That identity is not self-established. Why we often refer to emptiness as selflessness. There is no sort of inherent self within anything that we encounter. It doesn't have its own inherent identity. How this is explained in the easiest way, because I don't want to spend the whole night talking about emptiness, and probably would be fun to do that, but nonetheless, is I want to just touch on what are the three levels of dependent arising. The reasoning of dependent arising is said to be one of the most effective to realize emptiness, because we get that things still do exist, they do arise, but they don't exist in some kind of independent or self-established way. They are dependent upon other factors. First of all those things that are compounded or produced. Again, that's what it says in the little italics at the bottom there. All those things that do have that are depending upon their causes and conditions. So let's look at, for example, the body. Each of us has a physical body. That physical body depends upon causes and conditions. The most important kind of substantial cause of this body were the two cells that came together in your mother's womb, right? The sperm cell of your father, the egg cell of your mother that united and became the basis of this body. You still have, the genetic markers of all of that you're carrying with you till this body ceases. But essentially, there are many other conditions that gave rise to this body as well, including when you were in the womb and all the nourishment that your mother took through into her body that fed your body, kept the whole process of gestation in the womb happening. When you came out of the womb, all the food that you consumed there, the oxygen that you breathed, all the various factors that are maybe not as directly related in our welfare. But essentially, the body is dependent upon those causes and conditions. There's no independent body that exists without those causes and conditions, right? Causes and conditions are a necessary thing. This first level, we don't have much problem with, right? Because we do have a lot of conviction in the Western world in the whole thing of causes and conditions, right? You need to do these certain things to get that particular result. And anything that happens in our world, they always want to go back. Oh, well, they've got this particular result. Well, what are the causes that are giving rise to it? Like what they've done around climate change and so on. Identifying specific factors that they feel are contributing to what we are experiencing, this result. So the first level isn't so complicated, but it actually has great implication because even that first level speaks to emptiness. The second one is dependence upon parts. Well, let's look at the body in regard to this. Well, there are infinite parts to the body because even if we, keep going down and down and down, there are, atomic parts and subatomic parts and what have you. But let's just talk about real, like, kind of coarse or grosser parts of the body. You have your torso, you have your head, and you have your limbs, right? Your two arms and your two legs. You might be able to lose a part or two of the body and still have a body, maybe even four parts of the body. You could lose all of your limbs, as some people unfortunately have had that experience, right? A quadriplegic or whatever that has lost all of their limbs. They still have a body. They still have the essential parts of a body, but there's something that has to be there that are the parts of the body for body to exist. Body is the whole. Parts are the various things that constitute the parts of that whole. You don't have these two existing independently. They exist in tandem. The body that is the whole and the parts of the body that constitute the basis of that whole. You can't have one without the other. So again, this is speaking to kind of a subtler way that we can begin to look at how things are all arising on the basis of their parts, independence upon their parts. If we remove the parts, the thing cannot exist. Remove the parts of the body doesn't have any basis upon which its existence can be established because the whole depends upon its parts. The last one is where we use that idea of the parts to refer to that as what we might call the basis of designation or imputation. This third one is getting at this very, very subtle way that things exist. And again, these last two pertain to all phenomena. I'm not going to go into huge explanations of all of that, but in regard to everything that exists, there is this final third, most subtle level, which is the dependence upon mere imputation or designation, or even we could say conceptuality. What we are talking about there is that what we call the parts of the body, which is all this stuff from the top of the head down to the bottom of the feet, body is just a label we give to this basis. There's no real body that exists anywhere in this base of the head and torso and limbs and all the various inner organs and all the various other parts that constitute the basis of this what we call the body. In essence, everything is merely a label or an imputation, a conceptualization that we have in relation to a collection of stuff, the collection of stuff that we call the body. So what is appearing in front of you right now in terms of my body or my head, if you're not seeing my whole body, but my head, that is really just the basis for imputing head. Head is a label we give to this. Head and this that's appearing in front of you are two different things, really. They're interrelated. There's the label of head that is given to this collection of stuff that we have all agreed to call head. And just like we call this an eye and we call this a nose and so on. All of these things are merely designated through conceptuality. And of course, we use language to refer to those concepts. But there is even a way we conceptualize things before we have language. But language tends to be, as we become adults and move into the world of communicating with each other, that is what we are caught up in, right? Is all these labels, these designations we give to the variety of things that appear to us. All of those things don't have that identity from their own side. They're merely designated, labeled as that. That's why this refers to emptiness as like the other side of it. Dependent arising is saying things depend in these three ways to come into existence. Therefore, they can't have any independent existence. They are empty of that. They lack that. So these two are really like the two sides of the same coin. Their conventional way of existing, which is through our labeling in the end, that's again the subtlest way, various phenomena, to exist on the basis of certain things that are used as the foundation for those phenomena. And then the fact that those phenomena, therefore, can't stand on their own. They depend upon, in the end, that subtlest way of existing, which is through our designating them, imputing them. Again, I can't spend much more time in that on emptiness tonight. It's not the main topic of this text. But let's go back to what was being said. And we had three different ways we could talk about this. Meditate on the emptiness of both pride and discouragement. Well, you can do that, right? You can think, my pride is also a dependent arising. It's merely imputed to specific thoughts that I'm calling pride. Pride has no inherent existence. Once more, that's why pride can be removed, is because it's not something that exists from its own side concretely. It's something that exists on the basis of causes and conditions and so on. So essentially, we can meditate on pride and discouragement in the way that Thupten Jinpa was saying in the footnote. We can meditate on the emptiness of samsara and nirvana. That samsara and nirvana are merely imputed, rising on the basis of their parts, rising in dependence upon causes and conditions. It's very liberating to work with emptiness if we're kind of getting it, getting to that point of recognizing that what we have been adhering to, what we've been believing in, what our ignorance has been caught up in, doesn't exist at all. And therefore, we can be kind of liberated from all of that. And then, of course, also, as we see in the last two lines, we'll get to that in a moment of this verse, the emptiness of all these various objects that are appearing to us. Now, I might mention that one of the factors that becomes a complicating factor in getting this idea of emptiness is that everything appears to exist in this fictitious way. This is the subtle imprint that we have in our minds that is the eventual thing that we need to remove to become a Buddha. When anything appears to us, like for example, I've got this little object that I'm holding here in front of you. It's got all these different beads on it. This was actually a little mala that Lama Zopa Rinpoche gave to me many years ago. So anyway, when I hold this up here, again, if you know what this is, maybe you didn't know of the word mala. Most of us didn't at one point or another. But if you don't know that, then you kind of get the first step is you kind of get the name for that, right? Someone says, "Oh," and we go, "What is that? Is that a necklace?" And you go, "No, no, no. This is a mala." What's a mala? A mala is, like a Buddhist rosary. You have beads on it for counting mantras and so on. So you get kind of the identification of it. That's the first step. But what happens, this is according to the way Rinpoche always presents it, what happens is at the very next instant, it seems like mala absorbs into this object that's around my thumb here. Mala and the basis become kind of one, so that it appears to be inherently existent, appears to have its own mala-ness, if you can use that word, from its own side. The first step was I was giving it that name, learning that name. Oh, this is a mala. If I stop right there, no problem. But the problem is that we've been adhering to this false existence for so long that it's naturally projected back to us. Suddenly, everything that appears to us is imbued with that false appearance, as if it's got its malness out here. And of course, the third step is that we don't even question that appearance. We just agree to it. And that's our ignorance. That's what keeps samsara going. That's what keeps us in an unenlightened state, is this ignorance that thinks that things exist in the way that they appear. Why I'm mentioning that in particular is because we're going to see later, I think it's in The very next part, that things, we want to see things as illusions, as kind of these appearances that arise but don't have any inherent existence. That's what's happening all around us all the time. If we really want to know what it is that we are trying to get rid of, this false idea, this ignorance that is grasping at things to exist in this inherent or independent way, it's how everything appears to us right now. Everything, every single moment. They say the only time that you don't have this appearance is when you're directly realizing emptiness. And then, of course, when you become a Buddha, you're free of it completely. But for us, every moment of our day, everything is appearing like it's real from its own side. It's got its own reality. It is self established, self instituting, existing by way of its own characteristics. There's many ways of describing this, but it means that things have a reality from their own side. And instead, things exist as dependent arisings, dependent upon causes and conditions, dependent upon parts, and dependent upon, in the subtlest way, our designating things as mala, as computer, as person, as head, as body, as whatever. Okay, so let's go to those last few lines. I'm sure there's going to be some questions about all of this, but we'll deal with that. I didn't pull up the verses. Let me just read them. And verse 14de says, "When objects of attraction or aversion appear, view them as you would illusions and apparitions." Of course, that's based on the fact that they are empty. The objects we are attracted to that are very desirable, those that we have an aversion towards, they all appear to exist inherently, but they lack that. They have no existence in the way that they do appear. So we see them as kind of illusions and apparitions. This is a little correspondence to this wonderful text. I think I did a quote from a couple of verses from this, the 37 Practices of Bodhisattvas by the great Tibetan master Tokme Sangpo. It's verses 23 and 24 that deal with the same subject. First, the attractive objects. When you encounter attractive objects, delicious food, wonderful music, beautiful people, whatever the case might be, though they seem beautiful, like a rainbow in summer, don't regard them as real and give up attachment. This is the practice of bodhisattvas, because attachment is based on that ignorance that grasps at what is appearing to us as real. They appear to be inherently attractive, appear to be, beautiful from the top to the bottom. We kind of are imputing and kind of having that experience of those objects in a fictitious way. They don't really exist in that way at all. Then, verse 24, all forms of suffering, everything that is an object of aversion, are like a child's death in a dream. A child's death in a dream is pretty traumatic to go through, but it's really just a death in a dream. It's not a real death. In the same way, what is happening to us that we call suffering or painful stuff, it doesn't have the reality that we think it has. Some reality, that reality is very slight, again, merely imputed, merely designated. But nonetheless, we use that analogy that everything is appearing kind of like something traumatic happening in a dream. Holding illusory appearances to be true makes you weary. Therefore, when you meet with disagreeable circumstances, when you have things that you have aversion towards, see them as illusory. This is the practice of bodhisattvas. So this is kind of one of the main practices. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would emphasize this a lot, to see things as illusions, or he liked the phrase hallucinations. you know, like there's something appearing there that isn't how it actually exists. And there are all these wonderful metaphors that are used in Buddhism by the Buddha in many of the sutras, and the Prajnaparamita, Perfection of Wisdom sutras, that teach on emptiness. Many of these different examples that really are very rich, such as, working with things as being like a dream. Well, if we look at our dreams, we get really caught up in our dreams. We have a lot of emotion in our dreams, right? Might wake up really excited about something delicious and delightful that was happening, or very fearful because something was really quite threatening in our dreams. It's just a dream. It doesn't have any real nature in terms of our waking life. Well, the Buddha says everything is like a dream. We're not totally negating its existing. We're just recognizing that there are various appearances, various things happening, and they are all just appearances within the scope of all this. And we need not get caught up in these, especially these two patterns: attraction and attachment to what is pleasurable, and revulsion and aversion towards what is unpleasurable. Some of these other analogies are set out in the wonderful Vajrakutter Sutra. This is a little passage from almost the tail end of the Vajrakutter Sutra. How should one correctly and thoroughly teach? Just how one should not correctly and thoroughly teach. Therefore, one says correctly and thoroughly teach. As a star, a visual aberration, a lamp, an illusion, dew, a bubble, a dream, lightning, and a cloud, view all the compounded phenomena like that. I'm not going to go into a whole explanation of this, but it's one example of how the Buddha used these various metaphors for how we can see things as appearing in one way but existing in a different way. You know, a mirage is sometimes used even, because a mirage appears to be real water, and then when we approach it, we of course see that it isn't. So need to kind of keep moving on just for the last few minutes that I have here. Um, let's go on to verse 15, where we kind of move into maybe still some elements of emptiness, but we're also getting into the fact of how things arise on the basis of karma. When you hear unpleasant words, view them as mere echoes. So like the idea of karma is that anything we experience, such as unpleasant words, is the ripening of our past karma. So what is an echo? An echo means that when we shout through our own voice in a huge cavern or whatever, eventually that voice comes back as something we hear. It's the same type of idea here, the kind of boomerang effect of karma, which is actually set out in the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, text by Dharma Rakshita, who was one of Lama Atisha's great masters. But the idea here is that this is how we should look at this unpleasant speech that we hear as the echo of our own karma. Then the next two lines, when injuries afflict your body, see them as the fruits of past deeds, right? That anything that happens to us physically as well as verbally was in the first part, we see that as the ripening of our own karma. Things eventually come back around. Let me share just a little bit of the slides that I've got for this, and again, give some additional meaning perhaps. Alex says, this is like Lojong. Of course, remember, this text is really the grandfather, if you will, of Lojong, the great predecessor of all the Lojong mind training teachings that followed. He says that it's like that text, Lojong text, that Atisha's teacher, Dharma Rakshita, wrote. And again, that's usually, it's called the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, that when we hear unpleasant words, it's like an echo. So the nasty words that we've spoken ourselves are now coming back to us and we're hearing them again. Remember, that's one of the results from karma, is that we have something similar to what we did to others that we have to experience. And secondly, in the last two lines of that verse, when harm happens to my body, well, this has come from my karma. We've thrown the boomerang out, as it were, and now it has come back. We create all our troubles ourselves. Other people may be circumstances, but we've created the conditions to meet with those circumstances. Of course, karma does have a relation to emptiness because it's within the cause and effect of karma that we have these various experiences. And that, once more, can be changed because of emptiness, because things are not cast in stone and inherently existent. Here's one verse from the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, a wonderful text to study in the basic program if you ever get a chance. Whenever suffering arises in our mind, it is definitely the sharp weapons of bad actions turning against us. This idea of like bad actions, it's like a discus that we've thrown out that's got all these sharp edges to it. We've thrown it out, and it's like that boomerang. It comes back and hits us, causes us to suffer. And this arises from having disturbed the mental continue of others, having made them suffer. That's why we have suffering in our minds, is because we've made others suffer mentally. Now we should willingly take upon ourselves all their dukkha, all their suffering, without exception. So it's pointing in the direction of this practice of Tonglen, again, that I won't talk about much in this course, but the idea is that we want to always have this uh, awareness that we are the creators of our own experiences. We are the ones that are behind everything that arises in our life, good, bad, or indifferent. That is, for some people, a bit kind of overwhelming, but it's meant to be very empowering. If we see that we are actually the agents of what we are experiencing, well, then we as agents now can decide that we're going to respond to what's going on in a very different way. we're actually going to create more healthy patterns. So we can stop those harsh words. We can stop that physical suffering that comes to us. That's an important part of understanding the law of karma, is that, we are actually the ones responsible for everything that we are experiencing. All right, let's go on to verse 16. We're really changing tracks here now. We're moving into this idea of kind of abiding in a place where we can really focus on our practice. The advice from Lama Atisha in verse 16 says, dwell utterly in solitude, beyond town limits. Like the carcass of a wild animal, hide yourself away in the forest and live free of attachment. I mean, beautiful advice if you can follow it, but nonetheless, it's, maybe something we can aspire to kind of be out there on our own in some sort of place of solitude where we can engage in much deeper practice. It's kind of interesting. I mean, bodhisattvas are not necessarily wanting to do that exclusively, right? Because they need to be around beings to engage in more meritorious activities, to practice generosity, to practice morality, and so on. So it's not that this is an across the board thing that you should dwell in solitude for the rest of this life and every lifetime after this. That's not the advice that's being given. It's recognizing that one part of our practice may be to move into a space of solitude. And we might need to do that for some portion of our lives to affect any real major change. Going back to those teachings Alan Wallace gave in his Attention Revolution, he talks about how in these stages of developing this very single pointedly focused mind, you can only get so far with a working life, with kind of trying to do your meditation practice every day and then continuing to be involved in worldly affairs, you know, texting and emailing and doing all the various things that distract us. If you go on retreat, though, in a place of solitude, you can advance your practice greatly if all the conditions are there for that, because you don't have all those distractions. You shut all of that off and you focus on your spiritual practice. So I'm going to just share a few slides that pertain to this whole idea of engaging in solitude, that being one part of the Bodhisattva's practice. Verse 36 of chapter 8. Chapter 8 of Master Shantideva's text deals with meditation, the perfection of concentration or meditation. And so he has the same idea in a few verses. He says, there, meaning kind of in this place and kind of in the woods in solitude, in a cave, what have you, with no befriending or begrudging, I will stay alone in solitude, considered from the outset as already dead, thus when I die, a source of pain to no one. And I've already kind of isolated myself away from everybody. So in a way, I'm sort of already dead to them, kind of like that carcass of an animal that was mentioned by Atisha in his text. Then there will be no one standing by in tears and mourning, thus to trouble me. When I do, death does happen. I don't have to worry about that being a distraction. For no one will be there distracting me from thinking of the Buddha and the practice. Again, not for everybody, not for all of us. We don't have that strength of mind yet, perhaps. But for those who really are at the right place, being in solitude can have again, very liberating qualities to it. Therefore, in these lovely gleaming woods, with joy that's marred by few concerns, where mental wandering will cease, I will remain in blissful solitude. Again, that's a very uh, idyllic way of looking at it, but it takes a lot to get to that point where we are actually ready to engage in that type of single pointed meditation practice and what have you. To that end, I do want to share. I've got the transcripts of when His Holiness taught on Chapter 8 back in 1999. I had the good fortune of attending that at the Kalachakra initiation in Bloomington, Indiana. Prior to the initiation, he gave teachings on Chapter 8. And in one of the questions he got was from a woman who said, my husband has this aspiration to kind of go off into the woods and practice in solitude in the way that's being described in this text. Is this what you recommend to everybody? Kind of taking some issue with it because it is quite difficult on the person who's left behind if you're in a partnership with somebody. And His Holiness says, no, 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 no. You need to attend to the needs of your partner too. And there are very few people that are actually ready for that level of commitment. He said, and what can happen is often is people go off into the woods and do these sorts of things, go find that cave in Nepal or whatever, and they don't really have the right causes and conditions to be able to do much with it. and they end up wasting that time. And moreover, they've destroyed their relationship because they've not taken care of what's right in front of them, the people that they live with, the people that are instrumental in their everyday life. So don't think that by this advice in this line in particular, this verse about the idyllic qualities of solitude, that this is beckoning you to go do that, at this moment, that you absolutely have to engage in that because that's the only way to kind of get further on the path. I'll just share a little verse from a little bit from Geshe Dargi, and then I think we're about done for tonight. See if there are any questions. If my relatives do not hear of my happiness, Milarepa said, then my enemies also do not learn of my suffering, and I die alone without any mourners. Well, if all that happens, then all my wishes as a yogi will have been fulfilled. I can kind of let go of all those objects that of attraction, of aversion. I can die alone without any of that kind of distraction. Well, how wonderful, how idyllic. Again, not something we all kind of cozy up to initially. Let's stop there. Yeah, because we're getting into a whole nother territory here. So we do have a bit of verses to cover in regard to finishing things off. But once more, I will make sure that we do that in our final class next week. So any questions or comments about what we talked about tonight? I know it was a lot. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jay. There are actually a couple of translations that are out there of this text. Did you want to say something, Jay,
Yeah,
to
I
that or
also have
to?
a question.
Sure.
Uh, did you get an email from me with this question?
I
Obviously not.
don't,
Yeah.
maybe I didn't get that email. I know I had the one question before that you had sent, and I think I talked about that. Anyway, please go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. The question that always confuses me with regards to bodhisattva energy and how to direct it.
Mm,
It's an effort, but I can, because I can see politicians, I can sort of handle governmental representations, but I still have an ongoing issue dealing with corporations, grocery store chains, those kinds of things where I don't really have a visual on anybody. And it's very hard for me to channel and counter my anger, um, to channel bodhicitta. So I'm wondering, because this isn't addressed anywhere, this was maybe not an issue a few hundred years ago. Yep, that's my question, how to address.
Actually, I know that you said it. I remember seeing it, and I'm sorry I haven't replied. It just,
No, no, I
busy.
asked that it be addressed here anyway.
Okay.
It wasn't
Okay,
a
good.
personal question.
Yeah. When we start talking about corporations, these conglomerations of course, there are people behind it. We can say that there definitely are people that constitute the corporation. Corporations don't exist independent of people. There's an interdependence going on there too, right? So it is a little bit harder because we see the actions of these corporations in terms of the decisions that they make and the products that they sell and the way that they obtain their resources and all the various things that are involved in corporate behavior that are kind of hard to work with at times. And I guess we do have to strip it back down to, but those decisions and those things that we see corporations do are really just an extension of the people who are involved in those corporations. That we don't really try to um, completely remove it because we recognize that a corporation cannot exist without the people who function as the heads of those corporations and the various pieces of the corporation as you go down the ladder from the CEO or whatever all the way down into the workers and what have you. And some of them are more involved in decision making around what the corporation does and than others are. So we do want to work with this idea that if we're trying to generate compassion or loving kindness towards a corporation, we're really thinking about the individuals who make these sorts of decisions. So say we see a corporation that is engaging in a lot of misbehavior, doing a lot of things that are not beneficial to our planet, not beneficial to the beings that live in this world, and so on. Well, then we think about those beings who are making those kinds of decisions, who are driven by the whole corporate structure and the greed that is behind that, the desire for continual increase in earnings and all the various things that feed into that, and try to have maybe it's a little more widespread compassion and loving kindness, but it's definitely still directed at the same sorts of ideals. ideas. The same thing of we have various afflictions and ignorance and the various things that arise from that, the greed, the attachment, and so on, that prompt individuals to be making these sorts of decisions that steer the corporation, that move us into, the behaviors that those corporations engage in. So I think it's still all in the same camp. It's just that we have to maybe take it down to that level of the individuals, whoever those might be. And we don't necessarily know those individuals, but we can imagine them. We can say, oh, yeah, there must be somebody who's a CEO who makes some pretty important decisions about that. And maybe a chief financial officer that is making some certain decisions and so on. And we can see the delusion that's behind that. And we can generate some same thoughts that we would to any individual. Does that make some sense, Jay?
Yes, it's just difficult.
Yeah.
My
Well,
anger is
yeah,
endless and has been for decades about corporations. So,
yeah,
it's just
yeah.
something I have to deal with. The other comment I do want to make is also it's hard for me to look around at the condition of the world, to
Mhm.
accept that it is a reflection of my karma and to not feel guilty.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is
Oh,
a,
gee, I wish I hadn't have done whatever led all this.
I think we all do, you know. But again, we just have to. Uh, I mean, the instruction I've always gotten from teachers on this that I always try to convey on is that guilt is kind of an extra thought on top of some level of regret. Remember, with negative karma and with what we're seeing and experiencing that is unfavorable, that is a product of negative karma, having some level of regret is healthy, because regret is saying, okay, I wish I hadn't done these things. I wish I hadn't created that particular karmic seed that ripened into this particular experience and so on. Nothing wrong with that, because that spurs us to do two things: to purify any negative karma we've created that's similar, and secondly, to avoid doing that in the future so that we don't have to experience those types of results. So that's healthy. Regret is healthy. It's one of the four opponent powers for purification. Guilt adds on another thought. Because so we say, yes, I regret that I did these things. I wish I hadn't done them, and I'm a lousy person for doing them. That's what guilt does. It's a totally unnecessary thought, and moreover, can be defeated by what we talked about earlier tonight, by Buddha nature, by recognizing that we do have the potential to be this amazing, pure, divine being. We just have to create the causes and conditions for that. We're not inherently lousy or awful or deficient or whatever. Those things, yeah, are things we struggle with right now, but we are not that. There's no need to kind of put that additional thought on and say, I'm a bad person, I'm a horrible person. That's the pattern of guilt. I do always find it really quite interesting that the word guilt, to my knowledge, and I've heard this from other teachers as well, there is no translation of that word in Tibetan. In the East, it doesn't seem like they have that concept so much. Maybe they have it in very subtler ways, but they don't have a word for it like we do. We all know this word guilt in the West. We grow up with this, right? Guilt, guilt, feel guilt about this, guilt about that. Our parents even instill a lot of guilt in us, right? About certain things that they wish we hadn't done or whatever. And we feel guilty about it. We feel like we're horrible people because we did these things. This is a total mental construct. It's just something that we have put together on the basis of those sorts of thoughts. Yes, I did these things. Fine to take responsibility, but to call yourself a bad person because of that and put yourself down through this mind of guilt is just doesn't do anything. It only makes us more miserable. Getting free from guilt does take some effort, but recall Buddha nature. Recall that once more. This isn't indicative of who we are. These actions that we're engaging in that are unskillful, the states of mind that are deluded and afflicted, who we are at our core is this pure, pristine, and divine being that we need to make manifest by addressing all these things. And they can all be addressed because, once more, they're adventitious. They're not in the nature of our minds.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah,
That
we all
helps.
still struggle with it. I know, Jay. It's really, really tough.
I too have the Catholic background too.
Yeah, there's a lot of Catholic guilt. There's a lot of Jewish guilt too from all my Jewish friends that I've heard
Yeah.
about. So we got our share of guilt in the West. But I was going to say back on the corporations question, well, if you lived here in the US, you'd know that the Supreme Court decided corporations were people. Unfortunately, they made that decision some years ago, and we deal with the ramifications of that still. But nonetheless, um, yeah, maybe we can end there tonight. I'm sorry if are there other questions that really need to be answered tonight? Because we're already a little over, but everyone's okay. If you have questions, again, please feel free to forward them on to Sheila or whoever, Pat, or you can send them to me. My email address is, I give it out freely. It's Don Handrick, or make sure you spell Handrick with an A. A lot of people spell it as Hendrick, and then it ends up with some other guy I don't even know. Don Handrick at yahoo.com. So you can always send it to me there. And I will do my best to answer those questions, or if there's something that needs to be answered in a larger group like this, try to bring it into our final class. But it's hard to believe we got one more class left. But as I said, I'm sure we'll get through all of this. I just won't say quite as much, but we'll still get to the meaning of the remaining verses. So let's do our dedication prayers. We're just going to do these first two that are the first one that's on the screen, where we dedicate for the result that we had in mind when we set our motivation of bodhicitta. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then the prayer for this bodhicitta to grow and develop through our practice, through our study, for it to never decline, for it not to diminish, but only continue in that trajectory. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then let's just do the prayer for His Holiness, for His holy wishes to be fulfilled, and included in that are our thoughts for His Holiness, to have a long life, good health, and the same for all of our teachers, as well as for the very swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, for his reincarnation to be identified, for us to be able to benefit from his presence once again. So we'll just recite again the top prayer there. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. The last thing I always throw in there is just to dedicate for those beings that you're holding in your heart right now. I mean, we all have people that we know individually who are going through various levels of suffering, various experiences that are unsatisfactory. And then we also have parts of the world, and even in our own country, where we have a lot of strife and a conflict, a lot of things going on in the world that we can also be moved by. Send this positive energy out to whoever it is that's moving you at this time, who opens your heart. Feel like they receive this positive energy that we've created, and it immediately removes all their suffering, freeing them from that completely, and also helping them to have all the causes that would lead to their complete happiness. And may this be so for all beings through what we've done here together tonight. Okay, everyone, have a good Sakadawa. Sakadawa is tomorrow. It's a very meritorious day because it commemorates the birth of the Buddha, the enlightenment of the Buddha, and the passing from this life of the Buddha. So you have three amazing uh, events in the Buddha's life that are commemorated on this very powerful day, this full moon of the fourth month of the lunar year. So please try to refrain from anything negative for sure, because anything you do gets increased like 100 million times, according to Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Try to engage in virtue. Try to hold bodhicitta motivation through all of your actions, and do whatever you can, participate in various things that might be going on through the center there or other centers, or even on your own in terms of spiritual practice and study and so on. All right, good.